basis for this report, considering constant fears about management of this resource. A new report on the management of oil in Uganda has downplayed brewing political tension and talk of corruption, and suggested that Uganda's entry into the oil club has started with many good signs. The report, titled Oil in Uganda, International Lessons for Success, which was launched here in Kampala on Tuesday, says that so far Uganda has taken good steps compared to what has happened in other countries in preparing for its oil production. The oil debate in Uganda has often been punctuated by fears and perceptions, including concerns that the oil revenues would be stolen by political leaders and that the oil companies will gain more than the country. There have also been concerns about lack of transparency, accountability, and a weak legal regime. The 9th Parliament has raised many of the concerns ranging from land rights to management of the oil resource in the famous oil debate, and even they were recently considering one of the critical laws to manage the oil and gas sectors. It notes that Uganda has a competent team of capable technocrats, especially in the Petroleum Exploration and Production Department of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. There is, however, a risk that these expert voices are being frustrated by the executive, and that the proposed Petroleum Authority and the National Oil Company may cause more confusion in managing the oil resource. The report warns about political pressures which may result in revenues being spent rather than being invested, bring about economic troubles. Some members of the Ugandan civil society involved in oil matters have, however, dismissed the report, saying it's another government report with no facts from the ground. Now, this report concludes that despite all these concerns, Uganda is making gains, and that there is still a lot of time and opportunities to avoid the oil curse if lessons are taken from other countries. Now, the author of this report and 2 researchers are with us on Spectrum tonight to unpack that same report, taking into account the concerns, fears, and perceptions that are prevalent about the Ugandan oil discovery. Our guests, Mr. Ben Shepherd, author of the oil report on oil, International Lessons for Success. You're most welcome, Mr. Shepherd.
Good evening, sir.
We're also joined by Mr. Tom Balemesa, research officer at Accord. Accord is the Advocates Coalition for Development and the Environment. That's a think tank in this country. You're most welcome, Mr. Balemesa.
Thank you, sir.
We're also joined by Mr. Thomas Cargill, researcher at Chatham House, London. You're most welcome, Mr. Cargill.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shepherd, how do you tell an oil and a resource-rich country is on the way to becoming a curse or a blessing?
Thank you. That's a very big question. Before I start, I just wanted to make clear I'm not an oil industry expert. I'm a political analyst by training. So the approach that I think you can see through this report is one of an outsider to some extent, someone trying to decode the complex realities of oil. It's a very difficult technical business, and it was a very big challenge to try and understand what the issues were. So in part, this report is an attempt to explain in very simple terms, almost write the report that I would like to have read myself when I was first looking at these issues. So with that out the way, how can one tell whether a country is on the road to success? What this report tries to do is take the lessons from 4 countries that are often cited as relative success stories in managing their natural resources, and they're Norway, Chile, Indonesia, and Botswana. They're all very different countries. They have very different politics and histories. But what researchers have been able to do is find some points of commonality, some things that link the experiences of all those 4 countries. And the report goes into a little bit of detail on each of them, but in brief, there's access in the country to the best quality technical advice, and that advice is listened to, so there needs to be expertise. That the population understands how the government is going to spend the money they're getting from natural resources, so that people buy into a vision of what to do with the money. That there are strong social voices outside of politics that are able to engage in a conversation over the long term with government to make sure that prudent decisions are taken. And finally, that there's a sense of social cohesion, and it's a little bit difficult to define, but a sense that the population has a common desire to see both development and peace. So that was my starting framework to look at Uganda, and if you use those 4 criteria, there are certainly challenges here in Uganda, and as a researcher I've worked on Uganda since 2005, I've been here many times, I'm very well aware of what they are. But using those criteria, the starting point for Uganda, the birth of the dawn of the oil era, is not overwhelmingly negative. And that's not to say that there aren't challenges, and I hope the report doesn't minimise those challenges. It goes into some depth in terms of the challenges presented by the way that Ugandan politics has been going, in the way that Ugandans understand issues around oil. But it also says that Uganda starts with some strengths as well. You've mentioned yourself the technocratic capability inside the PPD, which I think is important. And I think there is to some extent a legacy here of a shared sense of Ugandanness, which isn't necessarily the case in other neighbouring countries in East and Central Africa, which provide a strong basis for Uganda to move forward. And all this report seeks to do, because as an outsider, as a non-Ugandan, it's not my place to tell Ugandans what they should be doing. That's a decision entirely for Uganda to make. But it tries to learn some lessons from the way that countries around the world have chosen policies that strengthen those four areas that I mentioned earlier, rather than weakening them. And it has no greater ambitions than that. And, I think Chatham House had a sense, and perhaps Tom can speak to this, but I did too, coming here and speaking to people about oil, that the debate around oil had become very hot, as you know better than I. And that debate risked losing some of the detail and some of the long-term strategic vision for how to manage a resource like oil going forward, because of the passions involved in the debates. So I think the main feeling that I had writing this was it would be a positive thing if everyone involved in the debate, from the opposition to government, to civil society actors, to the media and others, were able to take a little bit of a step back and consider some of these issues in a slightly more dispassionate way that looked to the long term. That's not to say that there shouldn't also be hot debates around politics, because politics will always have hot debates, but that oil could to some extent be treated with a little bit of consensus. And the report tries to point out where there are perhaps areas of commonality amongst all Ugandans. Everyone will share the same future, and in 20 or 30 years' time it will be the next generation or the one after that that will either, suffer the problems of the oil curse or reap all the benefits. So, I didn't set out, and I hope the report doesn't present an overly rosy picture of where Uganda is, and it certainly acknowledges the challenges. But at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to be pessimistic, and much is talked about the resource curse, and there are thousands of reports out there about the resource curse, and less work out there about what positive steps can be taken to try and make sure that a natural resource like oil is used for the benefit of all. So in brief terms, that was the logic behind the report.
I mean, obviously you sound like a man who set out to create a good report. There's a lot of negativity, so you should need at least one good, clean report to give hope. Is that what you had at the back of your mind when you set out? Give hope to these Ugandan people.
It was never consciously to give hope. It was more to remain neutral in the debate, and to provide unbiased information that would be of help to Ugandan policymakers and people watching oil.
All right. Let's hear from Thomas Cargill. You from Chatham House. Chatham House is a very respected think tank in the UK. Talk to us about the methods that were used.
Ben is the researcher and can probably talk about some of the methods better than I. I'll say a few words about Chatham House and the way that we operate, because we're an independent foreign policy, international policy research institute based in London. We've been around since 1920, so we're getting on a bit. It's almost our 100th birthday coming up. And we try to help policymakers, business people, civil society, anyone who is engaged in issues to do with international relations and political affairs. We help to inform their decisions. We do it, we're independent of government. Our full name is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and some people think that means that we are part of the British government, but that's not true. All it means is that the Queen is the patron of Chatham House, and under our Royal Charter, Chatham House can never take any institutional position on any issue. So if you hear media or other people saying Chatham House says this or Chatham House says that, that's not accurate. Actually, it's always the individual who is speaking whose opinion counts. And so, for instance, this report is a Chatham House report, but it's by Ben Shepherd, and it's the opinions of Ben Shepherd only. It's not the opinions of Chatham House. And of course that's...
So I could come up with a report tomorrow, you know, get your stamp somehow. I would like to know how I get that stamp, because I also have some weird views. You might want to put, and I want to use your banners, as you say. You have a disclaimer, it's not... I could come up with some outrageous claims, and you would stamp on those. Would you do that?
No, well, if you were writing on behalf of Chatham House or speaking on behalf... No, I wouldn't, because individual freedom is very important to the work we do, and so it means that we can have a range of opinions, because, as I say, we're not an advocacy NGO. We're not there to take a position on any one issue, and as you can imagine, on international affairs, and particularly on issues to do with African states, being based in London and knowing the history of colonialism and so on, we have to be very careful in the way that we frame things. For us, respecting the sovereignty of states around the world and engaging in a humble way that acknowledges that, for instance, as Ben says with this report, what Ugandans do with their oil is up to them. It's nothing to do with outsiders. But what we try to do is provide some information and ideas that Ugandans might find helpful in considering some of the options they have.
Listeners, this is Spectrum on Radio 1 tonight. A new report says Uganda is on the right path to avoiding an oil curse. What is the basis of this report, considering constant fears about management of this resource? Our guests tonight, Mr. Ben Shepherd, author of the report on oil, International Lessons for Success, Mr. Tom Balemesa, research officer at ACORD, that's a think tank based here in Kampala, and Mr. Thomas Cargill, a researcher at Chatham House, London. You will be able to call in and contribute to this discussion. Mr. Balemesa, you've read this report. What do you think of it?
Well, as Ben has put it, and what they really did, I was looking at the scope, because I took time to read through the report. It's
a thin report.
Yeah, it could be a thin report, but looking at research and looking at the scope of the work they had to do, like how they unpacked governance, I looked at how they unpacked governance for the particular aspects they referred to. I looked at basically the international lessons for Uganda, and I looked at the countries they looked at, that is Norway, Chile, Botswana, and Indonesia, and we had only one country from Africa, so I had a divided opinion on that. But still, that put aside, the report really puts across quite a number of interesting aspects that Uganda could look at, and he gets all these four countries and looks at some of the similar aspects that Uganda could borrow on to have an asset industry in terms of oil development and explorations. Then we go ahead to look at the options for oil management. Some of the options for oil management are really looking at the issues that are foundational. These are some of the issues that some people might not look at in terms of the depth, but they just look at the basic things like the land issues, the environmental issues, but some of the issues are really foundational. For instance, maintaining social cohesion in terms of contract transparency. Quite a number of people have talked about contract transparency, which is one of the issues that is really a burning issue around. Access to information, this is, I think you'd agree with me, this is something that is really having a lot of people in terms of divided attention. Then independent oversight mechanisms, these are some of the aspects that we've really been chatting about and trying to advocate for in terms of a better managed industry. Then I look at aspects like the imperative agricultural development. Well, here I would side with them, because quite a number of people have talked about this. Our president has talked about the idea of agricultural development, advising people to do agricultural development, and people haven't, obviously. The eyes are all set on one aspect of oil, and to me that is those are some of the really strong points that came out. Then empowering experts, listening to voices, that advice that is really from people who are specialists, that is looking at independent financial advice, engaging population on spending decisions. These are some of the important things that are foundational. their foundation, if I'm to get their foundation, really, they don't, like, for instance, come out strikingly fast, like, to consider someone who is in the Albertine,
Yes.
the local person, or the indigenous person, as usual put them. So they are things that will lay the foundation for a nascent sector. So to me, it is a research that is really, like I usually put up, like in the form of a pyramid. It comes from up, then comes down, but the middle is what we are really lacking to get to fill these gaps. That's why for us, as we look at these aspects, most people here get to look at the striking issues. Yes, talk about land transactions, talk about compensations, talk about infrastructure development, talk about environmental issues, talk about wildlife. So to me, these are things that are intertwined with what they put up in terms of in terms of the research report that they really put across. Then the other thing is basically they have the idea that Uganda has really got some time to do what it has to do, and we have got that space where we can do a lot of corrections in case we go wrong. I will not subscribe to that saying that, you know, in Africa there's no hurry, but usually people
Sometimes there isn't.
Yeah, sometimes there isn't. In fact, most times there isn't. So that is the very interesting bit of it. But those are some of the things that I really find quite interesting in the report. And yes, as we talked about, it may be being a bit of shallow, but I specifically looked at the specificity of the report. If I don't get into the details of research, and they had something really to put across that we could really learn from.
I'd like you to respond briefly to that, but even as you do that, let's not criticize the report necessarily. There was a report put out some time back. It was called the Contracts Curse, put out by civil society. A lot of people, you know, had their input in it. Did you look at that, and what do you think of it? The dichotomy between that and your own very optimistic report.
Sure. I won't speak to the detail of the report. I read it some time ago. But the question of contracts, you know, of whether the PSAs should be released or not, has obviously been a subject of intense debate and controversy here in Uganda. I haven't read the PSAs, I don't know the content. What the report points out is that it's becoming standard practice across the world for these reports to be released, that the oil company Tullow has said that it's prepared to release the reports as it's done in Ghana, should the government be amenable to it. So my perspective really on that question, and it speaks to the wider issues around transparency, is that a lot of energy and time has gone into a debate over these PSAs, whereas it's very possible that the PSAs themselves are okay, you know, and the debate that's been had, the time and the energy that's been used, could have been better used looking at some other issues. And actually, from a government's perspective, perhaps it would have been helpful for them to release the report, to draw some of the heat out of the debate, and use the energy, time and minds of the people looking at oil to talk about some of the more difficult, forward-looking things. So, you know, for me, the contracts are a very good example of why transparency is important. And it's not simply because it's a way of avoiding corruption, although that's of course important. It's a way of avoiding rumour. You know, and if people are aware that there are things that are being kept from them, they will start
begin to suspect.
And they'll start to speculate.
It's natural.
It's entirely natural.
Right.
So, some form of, you know, provision of information to the Ugandan people, in very basic terms, laying out what the realities of oil are, I think could be hugely important, and not just for civil society or for the opposition, but for government too. Because an overheated debate
isn't good for anyone.
Isn't good for anybody, you know, and it risks decisions being taken by accident rather than by design. And some of the decisions being taken now will have such a big impact on where Uganda is in a generation or 2 generations. It would be, you know, it would bring real risks if these detailed questions aren't thought through very carefully and that people don't understand them. So I think the PSAs is a very, very good example. And we don't come down, you know, as Tom said, Chatham House isn't an advocacy organisation, so there aren't recommendations in here saying government must release PSAs. It simply points out that not doing so
clouds the matter.
Clouds the matter and might have created some unnecessary problems.
Right.
So that was the way we tried to approach those issues.
All right, but let's talk about the environment in which you're releasing this report. A great deal of corruption. You talk about technical expertise. That probably is not enough to ensure transparency. How do you deal with that?
Well,
people won't steal your money because they don't know what to do. You might have the expertise, but people will steal money all the same. Look at the environment right now. Civil service, billions being lost every so often.
No, I'm not.
How do you synchronize that with your own opinions here?
Absolutely, no. I'm not minimising the problem of corruption in any way, shape, or form. I'm simply saying that the debate around oil, shouldn't necessarily be used as a proxy for a conversation about corruption. Corruption is an issue that affects Uganda, affects many countries around the world. Dealing with corruption is very, very difficult. And it needs institutions, it needs will, it needs all these things. But saying that the debate in oil needs to be conditioned by a current problem around corruption, again risks the debate being slightly polarised. Now that said, for me, one of the big lessons from looking at examples of countries around the world, and Chad is one that I mentioned in the report, is that you can have the best written laws and the best designed frameworks, and they don't really matter very much if they're not respected. And over the long term, the way that you gain, the way that you ensure that governments and other people in power respect legal frameworks and respect the rules is by building the kind of public consent, the relationships with Parliament, strong voices, informed people that are able over the very long term to hold government to account and maintain a healthy relationship between government and people. So I don't have an answer to what Uganda should do about corruption today, and that wasn't what this report was intended to look at. The point I would make is that, corruption is a big part of the oil curse. Everybody knows that very well. You can look at Nigeria, you can look at the other places around the world that have suffered badly, and everyone understands that. But the question is, how does Uganda avoid going down that road? But it's a forward-looking point, and it's, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know what the answer is today, because I don't.
Well, this is Spectrum on Radio 1. We'll go for a break. We'll be back to stay tuned.
The Call of the Wild this Valentine's with Reds. Buy Reds and win a getaway for 2 to the Wild Waters Lodge, plus other amazing prizes. See present posters for details or visit your favorite bar or supermarket. Happy Valentine's Day from Reds. Crisp, clean apple taste.
Not for sale to persons under 18.
Communications Commission invites entries for the 3rd ASIA Awards, scheduled for June the 7th, 2013. Visit www.ucc.co.ug/awards for information on the categories and criteria. Deadline for entries is April the 30th, 2013. ASIA, ICT Innovation for National Development.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.
Welcome back on Spectrum tonight. A new report says Uganda is on the right path to avoiding an oil curse. What is the basis of this report, considering constant fears about management of this resource? Our guest tonight, the author of that report, Mr. Ben Shepherd. The report is called Oil in Uganda, International Lessons for Success. Mr. Tom Balemesa, Research Officer at ACORD, that's the Advocates Coalition for Development and the Environment think tank. Mr. Thomas Cargill, Researcher at Chatham House, London. You will be able to call in and contribute to this discussion at some stage. Thomas, talk to us about the environment in which this report was released. Some people will think you had an interest in sanitizing the environment. There's a lot of corruption going on.
Well, as I say, because all the research that comes out of Chatham House is very individual, there's no collective interest. There doesn't exist such a thing. We know Uganda, for me, I've been coming here since '96, as Ben says, he's been working on it since 2005. We know some of the challenges here, we know the excitement around the political situation at the moment. But I think, as Ben has said, we thought because the nature of the debate is so fierce and there's a lot of massive decisions to be taken over the next few years by Ugandans, it was really useful to have a report on oil, which is going to be important for generations to come. We thought it was important to have that report that actually tried to take a step back, to take a step out of some of the immediate political issues, and And of course that's important for us as well, because, you know, as I say, we're not Ugandans. We have to be very careful in the way that we engage on the debate, the broader political debate, and we're sensitive to that. And we didn't want to become distracted, or the work that we've been done to be distracted by some of these other very, you know, challenging political issues that are abroad. And that's why we're keen, I think, not to become too sucked into discussing some of these issues.
All right, Ben, as you respond, but I would like you to talk to us about some of the countries that have the oil cuts and what are some of the things that they would have done.
Sure. Just to speak to this last point, I mean, you say that the report says that Uganda is on the right path. For me, I would say that the report says that there is the potential for things to go well here, but there are also very serious risks. And actually, the phrase that I use in the report, in the first paragraph, is that Uganda is at a crossroads. You know, so we're not saying that the dynamic of oil is set, you know, to move in a positive direction. It could, you know, and I think the message of hope that you talked about earlier is there, because, you know, it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy if everyone assumes that things will go badly wrong. So yes, to speak about some of the other countries, you know, just very briefly, there are some interesting examples of initiatives that can be taken from Africa and from around the world. The report speaks about the Public Interest and Accountability Committee in Ghana, which is a committee that brings together 14 different representatives of civil society bodies, and that's very broadly defined civil society, so from traditional leaders to academics to business people to NGOs, to act as a sort of independent, recognised by law, oversight body, and body that's able to provide some accurate information for the Ghanaian people. I think that's very interesting. It speaks about a very local version of that was established in Alaska in the United States after the Exxon Valdez disaster in the late 1980s. That brought together the oil companies, the local people and the local government to make sure that there was lines of communication between them so that that kind of disaster could be avoided in the future. So from the transparency perspective, there's lots of options out there, and there's many more examples than are cited in the report. Other issues that I think are interesting is public consultation initiatives that are being taken in Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, which is, you know, has been an oil producer since the 1960s. It produces roughly what Uganda's production is projected to be. So it has a long experience of oil, and it has been a relatively peaceful, cohesive country for most of that time. But even there, they found that people didn't understand what the money was being used for. They started to feel resentful they weren't getting their fair share. So they organised a programme of consultations going around the country to speak to local people and make sure that they understood. So it's very simple things. Perhaps, you know, finally, very, very quickly, the question of how the architecture of oil management is put together. The report, you know, there's the Norwegian model that everyone always talks about, which is having an independent petroleum authority and an independent national company that each manage different bits of the industry, essentially, in partnership with government. But there's also models out there that put the responsibility entirely within a ministry, and don't have these independent bodies. I think Gabon is an example of that. And, you know, people who've worked on these specific technical issues for a long time seem to say there's advantages to both systems. That if you keep the responsibility in the ministry, you can build up expertise very quickly, and it's very clear who's responsible for the decisions. You know where the buck stops. It stops with the ministry and above to government. Whereas a Norwegian system that seems to separate.
Which is the one that seems to be, being adopted here.
Yeah, well, indeed, what the report says about the architecture here is that it seems to be a hybrid separation of powers system. That there will be
what a heavy input into the national gas policy from Norway.
Indeed, yes, and there will be obviously a petroleum authority and national oil company, but that there are very clear links. The celebrated clause 9 of the bill, as I understand it,
with the government.
With the government. So the report points out actually that the risks that brings are people don't quite understand where the responsibilities lie, and over time that might become a problem. So you know the report does touch on the experiences of lots of different countries, and as you say, it was a conscious decision not to only look at other African countries, because I feel that as outsiders, as Europeans, people lump Africa together as if everything is the same in African countries, and obviously it's not. It's very, very different indeed. So it felt important to us to look further afield for some valuable lesson learning. Obviously, as well as places like Botswana and more recently Ghana that seem to be doing relatively well. In Ghana's case, thus far, we don't really know.
Of course, it's probably a little bit too early for.
Indeed, yes, one can't make a judgment.
Tom, can you draw some lines for us? What about the case of Botswana, which is started as the big African success story with their diamonds, and Nigeria, which is regarded as a curse, not curse, and of course Nigeria signed on to the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency International. Draw some dichotomous lines there about how one can go either way, and which side do you think we are closer to?
Well, yes, you've cited very good examples. You've talked about Botswana, you've talked about Nigeria and how Nigeria has joined the EITI. Well, as Ben has put it, they looked at the Ghana model. Most people, like when they're looking at Uganda,
Ghana is a very recent one. You really
yes, it is a very recent one. But if you've been following the debates about oil and developments in Uganda, quite a number of aspects are being related to the Ghana model than the Norwegian model. So people look at the management of the industry itself, looking at Ghana. They look at the accountability committee, looking at Ghana.
Just said cases, Botswana with their dam ones, they've built hospitals and so on and so forth. In Nigeria, mangrove swamps swallowed up with oil, teeming with oil.
Yes. Yeah, when you look at Botswana, when you look at the two countries are really.
Which side are we closer to?
I wouldn't really commit ourselves to being close to any of those. Why? Because we have not even started. We haven't got even a banner
indicators. They talk about transparency as a key mark. We've not signed on to the AITI. Publish what you pay. We've not gone anywhere.
Yes, we haven't.
We've gone to sign. We're still not.
We haven't gone into any of those. Basically, we have just like Ben put it. In Africa, people think we have the same problems, but we're really quite different. When you look at Botswana, look at their transitions and how things have been going on in Botswana in terms of development. They are really quite different from Uganda. When you look at Nigeria, yes, Nigeria, given the population, the numbers.
You're talking like an academic. Let's use some case studies to draw lines. Eventually, have to draw lines.
Yes, we have to draw lines. So at the end of it all, we look at the two countries, and as we discuss these issues, we tend to get lessons from all. One aspect that we have to consider is that we can learn from the good, and we can learn from the bad.
Talking like a preacher all of a sudden. Thomas, how does the oil curse play out? Could you give us some wisdom on that? How does it normally play out? How can you tell it from a distance?
Well,
Ben, let's hear from you.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of different symptoms. You know, if you think of the oil curse as a disease, that don't all necessarily come together. But the common ones that people speak about are increased corruption. Obviously, that's a clear one. They speak about tensions between elements of communities, that some people benefit more than others, and those in oil-producing regions, for instance, who suffer more, feel they should get more. Sorry, my mind's gone.
Dutch disease.
Oh, the Dutch disease, indeed. That's very, very important. You know, that an economy becomes unbalanced by a big influx of natural resource revenues. The technical definition, I think, is that you end up with currency appreciation, so that our currency is worth more, and export industries die. And a country ends up basically addicted to natural resource revenues with no other way of providing employment or providing money. I think a very interesting one is an erosion of the relationship between a government and a people. I think that's very important, and that happens in part when governments don't have to rely on tax revenues anymore. They don't have to make a social contract with the people. They can get on with doing whatever they like off the back of money that seems to be free. And I think when people talk about the resource curse, there's lots of different ideas about how you might define it. It's when those issues start to interrelate, you know, and you get feedback loops between them, and you get into a vicious circle, and no one trusts government. You know, government weakens, government's controls weaken, therefore corruption becomes more of a problem rather than less. You know, therefore it's more difficult to do business, you can't get more jobs, so the natural resource revenues become ever more important. And then obviously the worst case scenario is that different political groups start competing for that resource. You know, which is where people talk about it being a conflict risk. So that there are many different sort of aspects to it, but I think in terms of the worst case scenario of how this can play out, it's quite well described. You know, people understand it quite well. What I was interested by, because as I said, I came to the oil field as a non-expert, was that there seemed to be much less work out there saying, okay, this is what a society can think about doing to avoid some of these things. What happened instead was lots of, you know, fairly technical policy recommendations about do transparency, or do oversight, or have a sovereign wealth fund, or, you know, which for a non-expert it's quite hard to understand why those things are important, unless you break it down and say, well, transparency matters because people need information. If they don't have information, they'll start suspecting each other of cheating, and then you have a problem. So it was interesting to me that one half of the resource cost literature is very, very well developed, and the slightly more, I don't know, difficult, forward-looking, what can countries do to avoid it, feels to be less well developed. And in part, that's what I hope this report would point towards.
Thomas, would you like to talk to us about the Dutch disease? Have you seen safety nets? Do you think Uganda's put in place safety nets to avoid the Dutch disease?
Well, the president, of course, has said that he would he wants agriculture to be to benefit from the oil wealth, and he wants Uganda to benefit from its incredible, agricultural potential. And I think what's very clear from Ben's report is that that is a real opportunity for Uganda, and it's absolutely seems to be a very, very correct policy in many respects, but that as soon as you have the oil industry starting to bring in receipts, you need to be very careful that the currency appreciation that might occur as part of that, so the shilling would get ever stronger. And the problem is that might make agricultural exports, which is what I think the president would like, it might make them very uncompetitive with other countries in the region, and this is the real dilemma. And again, as Ben says, there's no easy answers to this, but one of the answers that some countries have used is to keep back some of the money, keep back and build up a fund, and that way you can smooth out a little bit some of the impact that this oil money has on the economy. And for us, I think, as Ben has said, it felt as if much of the debate, not just in Uganda to be honest, but we work on oil issues across Africa and around the world, and as Ben says, there are millions of reports. Any policymakers or civil servants listening to this will really know the death by report that many of us suffer from. There's just so many clogging our inbox, but very few of them are written in a way which actually explain in not exactly simple language, because we know that policymakers and the policy world, they're educated, sophisticated people, but often the language that is used in many of these reports is so technical that even as Ben says, as researchers we struggle to understand what this means. And so we wanted this report to talk about some of these things, and in fact Chatham House's role is really to try and talk about very complex things in a way that a policy audience can understand, and that's what we try to do with the issues such as Dutch disease.
Tom, before we probably hear from the listeners, why has it taken us such a long time to get the oil out of the ground? It took Ghana 3.5 years. 6 years down the road, we're still waiting. We could wait another 6 years.
Oh, that's an interesting question.
We've not said our prayers hard enough. Maybe talk to us. You are the expert.
Well, it is quite a number of issues that relate to basically what I'd call natural resource management, and this along goes with our political stability and what we have on ground. Quite a number of things have been happening. You do bear with me. looking at the past, looking at the PSA, looking at how people are...
You talk about political stability.
Political stability,
We've had stability 27 years.
Yes, we have had stability for 27 years, but when you look at the pressures that are long, there's what we call stable peace in terms of natural resource exploitation. Then there is absolute peace for natural resource exploitation.
This man talks like those experts were described.
So,
he doesn't talk the Chatham House language. Go on, and
yes,
we'll try to understand.
Exactly. I'm going to explain that. I'm going to unpack it. When you look at what is happening today, like the political stability I'm talking about is looking at the institutions of government and how they operate, looking at the forces in parliament and how they're operating, looking at how all these issues are running and how the contracts are being signed. These are some of the things that are taking us long. In my opinion, I think we have really a long way to go in terms of putting all these aspects together, in terms of the regime that is supposed to manage the oil exploitation and basically the development of oil. That's my thinking and that's my opinion.
A technical man speaking like a technical man. Let's hear from you, the listeners. This is Spectrum on Radio 1. You can call in our numbers 0414-348-111, 0312-260-390, 0312-261-390. When you call in, please tell us your name and where you are calling from. You cite Norway as one of the examples to look at as a success story. Why do you talk about Norway? It's worlds apart from Uganda.
It is worlds apart.
Uganda.
Of course. But nonetheless, it is a society that's managed to do very good things with a huge bonanza of oil revenue. And, you know, for all that there are very clear differences between countries, and you can't just read lessons across, and, you know, you can't say do what the Norwegians did because it would make no sense at all. But obviously there are things that can be learned. You know, one of the things that the literature seems to talk about is the role of the fisheries industry in Norway, which I think is really interesting. When they first developed oil, the fisheries industry was worried, I think, both about environmental damage but also about the bigger economic things, and they were able to act as a kind of moderating voice in deciding what Norway's policies should be. Now, obviously, that equivalent doesn't exist here. In Botswana, people talk about the cattle-owning chiefs, the traditional chiefs, who were able to play a similar role. So you can't say that, you know, Uganda should develop a fisheries industry, or you know, the traditional authorities should play those roles. But you can say that it's interesting that in Norway it was important to have a voice that wasn't political, that was rooted in society, able to say, well, maybe we could be careful about these things. So that's one. The other, I just wanted to say, because I think it's interesting, you know, it's easy for experts to sound like there's answers out there, and if you look at the difference between the UK's behaviour with its oil revenues and Norway's, the UK spent all of its oil revenue.
Okay, Spectrum, hello. Good evening, your name? Yeah, about greedy leaders. Some of them move around with pot bellies. We call them pot bellies around here. Talk to us about what are we going to do about those men? Most of them are men, actually.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think, you know, the idea that the caller just gave of independent oversight of the industry is a very sensible one, and it's one that, you know, can be reflected on how that might work. I don't think that's necessarily should be seen as anything that's problematic. And the other, I think, is the importance of information. That you know, it's the case in countries all around the world that if people don't know what's going on, they assume that someone else is doing better than they are. And it's important for dealing with corruption that it's the real cases that are looked at, you know, and if it becomes too diffuse and the idea becomes too general, the real problems which undoubtedly are out there can sort of hide in this generalised sense of allegation that everyone is stealing. So, you know, I, as I said earlier in the discussion about corruption, I don't have an answer and we didn't seek to provide one, but I think there's ways that you can build institutions and build information flow flow that can help over time to make sure that that's minimised and hopefully in the end dealt with.
Let's talk a little bit about Botswana. Of course, the case of Botswana, it was about diamonds. Diamonds are not necessarily dirty minerals, but the money that comes out could have been abused. Also, we know that Botswana has had several changes of government, from Saket Masiriam and Festus Mogae and other people. Do you think that plays a part, successive governments? And Ghana has had that as well, change of government. Do you think having a government for 27 years could bring kind of what some people have called incumbency attrition, where government becomes complacent and corruption grows?
To be honest, I think you can argue it from both sides. If for one moment we take a step back from idealistic ideas about democracy or a particular kind of governance, and you take a step back, in one level, stability over the long term and certainty can be helpful for the development of an industry that needs long-term planning. But of course, part of that is to be able to have in place orderly successions to try and minimise disruption when governments change. And it's no secret that this is one of the challenges in Uganda that all politicians are facing with. But I don't think you can necessarily say that one system of governance is better than another, or that one government's experience shows that another government has to follow that particular model. Because as we've said before, each country is different and each country has to find its own way to some of these problems.
And just very briefly to add to that, I mean, there have been successive changes of leader in Botswana, but if I understand, I think I'm correct in saying it's been the same party since independence. So yes, the leadership has moved around, but in terms of pluralist democracy, it's been one party that's led the country. So it speaks to what Tom said, that political societies take different forms in different places, and if they work in one place, then that's great, but you can't necessarily say that other countries should be looking to follow that model precisely.
Do you think it's simply because it's diamonds in Botswana, not oil? Would the story be different if it was oil?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think in terms of volatility of the world market, I'm not an economist, but I think, diamonds are controlled by far fewer players. I think the pricing is more reliable. It doesn't fluctuate as much, so it's a bit easy to do economic planning. Probably it doesn't bring the same level of environmental damage. I think these are important things. But in terms of the basic fact of a lot of money coming into a country, I think the issues are probably fairly similar. And just to carry on Botswana, because I think it's very interesting, we do often talk about it as a success story, and it has been in terms of maintaining its stability, despite having this huge amount of diamonds. What I think Botswana's found more difficult is business diversification. As I understand, they've tried to get agriculture going, but they're in the Kalahari Desert. It's not Uganda, so it's very difficult to do that. And what people suspect is that that's ended up with a lot of people being employed by the civil service because there's no other jobs for them. Now, for Botswana, that hasn't caused problems, but it means that they're perhaps addicted to diamond revenues, and if you took the diamond revenues away, if the market fell apart, they might have problems. So it's not perfect either. It's easy to hold these places out as if they've got everything right, and I don't think they have. But there are things that can be learned from their experiences of both good and bad.
Yes, Tom. I mean, you can talk to us about.
Yes, the caller was really concerned about the leaders who are greedy. That's what I got. He's advocating for separate commission, just like Ben has put it. Well, looking at that different commission, that would really be perfect. But there are other initiatives too. You've talked about the EITI.
Yes.
The Publish What You Pay.
Yes.
These are some of the initiatives that could really come up to create checks and balances.
And why are we not signing on the EITI? We promise to sign, we're not signing on.
Well, it is. I'm not really certain. It should be our governance procedures and everything. Because there's a time EITI officials were here sometime, and they were talking about the slow pace of adjusting to EITI in Uganda. It has to be.
There are steps you undertake.
Yes, there are steps.
I think
that
4 steps
exactly
that you go through to sign on to EITI.
Yes.
We're not moving anywhere, we're just watching.
And the reason, in fact, the reason when I attended that particular meeting, the reason was basically it is about the governance of the country. That's how someone put it in blank. It's about the government.
Yes. In plain English.
Yeah, someone is like, it is about the parliament, the executive, and what they think about EITI. But they expressed a lot of optimism on that, especially as far as we are moving on with the industry and what is happening. If at all we get the laws done, and maybe we could be ready for that.
Well, let's scrap EITI. Nigeria is a signature.
It's not necessarily. Outside of this structure, do we have people? And we had some parts about you guys. They will not stay back.
The question about hope. Hope is all about, again, individual opinions. That's my thinking about hope. Because as a person I think, well, if you have resources on the ground, well, perhaps you could get there and then have the leaders giving their resources, depending on the checks and balances that they do.
Depending on the checks and balances, yes. So you think we need those structures to guarantee us?
We need these structures.
Then we fix them actually to get Ben, maybe as we go, would you like to talk to us about why you think civil sector many of the
Sure. I think there was a level of disappointment about what wasn't coming through, and I understand that entirely. We didn't talk a great deal about local issues, we didn't talk a great deal about environmental issues, about lots of issues that civil society organisations are set up to deal with and to look at. And I understand that completely. They're extremely important things, there just wasn't the space of time to consider them in this report. As was said earlier, the idea was to take on foundational issues. I think the second probably is that, as you said at the start, the tone of the report is not critical, it doesn't seem to be critical, it seems to be constructive. And it feels to me that the debate on oil over the last couple of years in Uganda has sort of devolved a little bit into something of a shouting match. And if everybody shouts, then what gets something through. And some in civil society, and I wouldn't by any means lump them all together, but some, I think, have played their part in that, and that oil has become used as a route to get into some bigger questions around the future.
You are going to pass before we go to Thomas. Talk to us at Chatham House. Would you do this all about?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, we've certainly learned through the launch and through talking to people, and we're very humble about the need to, when we do a report like this, we don't expect to say we've got everything right. And as Ben alludes, maybe there's some things that we've changed. But we've really enjoyed being in Uganda and interacting with people on this. And there's certainly a lot, I think, that we'll be able to take up and take back to London in terms of information about how the debate is going.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Penshep, also the Coordinator of International Associations. Thank you very much. Mr. Tom Balemesa, Research Officer at Court. Thank you very much for enriching that. Mr. Thomas, Research at Chatham House. Very smart guy, knows how to score this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for tuning in. I'll be your host, Edmond, with the special media station. A very smart guy.
I don't say I'm not very smart.
On this show are not necessarily those of this radio station or its management.
Did you expect this kind of reaction?
The general reaction?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I like how you responded, even when we presented the report, even when we discussed things about the record, I love the way he responded. It was really positive, and just like as you put it, it was so to do it again, really like this, this kind of foundational issues. So what we are so much restricted, I think, is that some of these issues people are mentioning about environment and not looking at the foundations.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's a bigger thing about NGOs. wouldn't want to say it necessarily evil public, but they're set up to do single issue stuff, and legally that's their job. You know, and they have to do their job well. They have to make a lot of noise about very
investments and potential fresh employment opportunities. The report indicates that UAE lacks mechanisms for registering new investors and the operators on whether or not these investments started operations or created the anticipated jobs. The report also discredits UAE for lack of SME policy, consequently stifling establishment of successful SMEs in Uganda. Committee Chairman Patrick Cambiat, who presented the report to Parliament, recommends the restructuring of UAE because it has significantly lost staff through resignations, which affects the performance. The Electoral Commission says it will dispatch electoral material for the Vitality national by-elections this Saturday ahead of the polling Monday. EC Chairman Manda Chikondo addressed the media briefing this morning, confirming 5 candidates in the race. He says 89,841 voters will participate in the election, adding that the campaign period will sparkling.